And welcome back to the Life Force Podcast. We're going over all the sort of major decks in the format right now, the sort of different archetypes that you can kind of choose. We're going to talk about some aggro stuff today. So let's start with the white aggro deck and talk about that a little bit here. So this is the deck that Tiffany brought to the GP, and it's sort of a stock standard white aggro deck with a little bit of spicy sauce. Generally speaking, you're going to want to use Tama as your center, and you're going to want your assist line to be Akino Rock and Akino Bye Bye. What you use your third assist line, either if you break out of mono white or you're trying something else, you could. There's reasons to go into either of those. Sometimes you also break away from Akino as well. But generally speaking, if we're talking about mono white, just to conceptualize, this is sort of like your stock standard list. We ended up, a lot of times you'll see Lion instead of the Donna. We ended up going with Glittering because Glittering actually has a lot of outs versus different decks, not just aggro decks. It really destroys aggro decks, by the way, but it is actually fairly pretty good against the control decks, whereas Lion is not good against the control decks. You're able to find guards, you're able to fill one hole, and with Hestia, which we'll talk about in a second, you're able to basically guard as well, so you can stop that 1 damage on the lane, 1 damage in an Elrig swing per turn. So Donna Glittering actually was fantastic secret tech. That worked amazingly in the GP. We've got Xenocluster and White Heaven. This is your defense against discard and Enter Denial, mostly Enter Denial, because this deck is Enter hungry, which is, by the way, if you want to beat it, Enter Starve it. That's how you win against this deck. And then White Heaven, which is a difficult way to win. It's like expensive, but it just bowls over certain decks, so it becomes a very, very good route to victory. Overall, your main deck is basically just going to be walls, right? In a lot of these mono white builds. Sometimes instead of walls, there are ways to draw extra cards, or there are ways to get a little bit of extra enter, but we opted for just walls. And it ended up being a very good choice because there's a lot of aggro in US Wixoss. There's just a lot of players that are opening up lanes and trying to attack damage, and I don't think it's a bad plan. In fact, I think it's a good way that the game is built, and I think that it's a solid plan. So instead, we decided to go with this. We ended up going to Driver's Ed more than Toyoki. I think we actually probably should have went more into Toyoki instead of Driver's Ed, because it just is better against aggro in general. But we like Driver's Ed, and we wanted to try it out more against the decks that really rely on Machina Wing Slash. So we used this for that. It ended up being pretty good. You're pretty standard always going to see 3 flash cards, 3 over pursuit. Sometimes that over pursuit is 4. And these are the main deck ways to bounce cards into the opponent's hands. So they're your main deck removal options. Basically, Lancelot and a spell that opens up a lane. You'll see some number of Orochimarus. The answer is usually 1 or 2. It bounces, it gets guards back. It's just a really good silver bullet to have in general. And then the assist, or the last lines here are mostly just walls. These are huge walls, just gigantic walls that are hard to deal with. Love Dobby is kind of interesting in the fact that Love Dobby, actually, because it doesn't get vanished very often, can kind of be pseudo card draw, because you don't need to replace it in the field all that often. You end up having more cards in hand in general because of it. But Remember is your key kill card. Almost every single matchup, Remember is fantastic for you in white aggro. We opted with Coella, which stops abilities when Signy attack, and Hestia, which stops damage if the Elrig were to hit you, or a Signy would hit you with this. You can basically stop 2 damage with this. It's a really fantastic thing to drop in with Donna Glittering. Overall, that is the white aggro deck that you're going to be seeing in the meta. I would be remiss to not go in here real quick and find, let's see here, Starfruit's version. So I haven't talked to Starfruit very much about this, but his version ended up using, it's mostly the same Elrig, or the same deck in here. Some cards are swapped out, like this is still 12k damage blocker. There's a little bit more damage up here. Mostly it's the same deck. The main difference is going to be in the Elrig deck, which I believe Umir Clear is to basically kill guards and really stop aggro decks from being able to punch back, especially the Dash Hirana decks. But it's pretty good against Tama as well, just changing the pace of the game, getting you an extra turn to deal damage. Deus Drive and Deus Shield is basically your way of merging the idea of you need a two-stop and a open lane that Akino or Lion was basically providing you and merging it into one. But the real trick here is Burning Curiosity. The more I look at, the more I'm like, yeah, it's just basically White Heaven, but it's like half a White Heaven. Which works with the deck and what the deck's trying to do. Ultra Superhero's incredibly strong, gets you an extra damage that you wouldn't normally have with Mill. White lacks a lot of ways to do burst damage like Red does, so it struggles as an aggro deck a little bit because of that. This is a good way of doing that. Getting that little bit of extra Mill damage is enough to eventually just win off of an extra burst damage and then do 5 damage a turn or 4 damage a turn, depending on the turn. And it also gets you a way to draw some extra cards, so you can get yourself some guards to survive. I think this is a little bit of a slower paced aggro deck, but I'd still put it firmly in the aggro deck portion, which is what we're doing. Let's go back into my decks here. Let's talk about some other aggro decks. We'll get back to the Yuzuki in a second, but we'll talk about Gozuko. So Gozuko is an interesting deck. This is my version of the Gozuko deck. We're going to talk more about it in its own video coming up here. But there is basically Gozuko. Let me just talk about the center. Really pushes itself towards being an aggro deck. It's basically silver bullets that you pull out, like whatever's good in a certain matchup, and then you try to multiply this negative 8,000 to do a lot of opening lanes in the late game. So it gives a little bit more reach than black aggro decks have had in the past. So if you like the black aggro deck, I would push myself towards that. There's Lion combo that still exists and is still pretty good. This is my attempt at sort of a flat throw version of it. You'll see that there is a Rhapsody party in here. Just more ways to filter, really, is the way it is. But really what pushes us more in the aggro direction is I'm now using Love It Mix. It needs a little bit of damage burst, and if your opponent is not expecting an DJ Love It Mix, you can really blow them out with just dealing damage on the field that this deck normally struggles with. But normally you're going to Endless Punchline here for dealing 3 Elrig damage. And what's really good about it is basically the deck's concept is more or less to, and you can watch a later video on this as well, put out 2 projection maps which make it impossible for your opponent to guard through the Endless Punchline. And then their next turn they'll be like, well, I'll guard that and I'll be fine to live through it. But that's where MC Lion comes in. And basically with the flat throw crush and MC Lion's ability to just get the last damage no matter what and end the game, this ends up being a turn 4 deck that kills your opponent flat out on turn 4 every time. Put that in the aggro deck format here. The next one to talk about is X Aggro and Deus Aggro. These are basically the same deck. I actually lean a little bit more towards Deus in my testing than I do X. It's really only worth mentioning that X, the difference is X gives you a little bit more enter, is a little less hindered by Remember than the Deus deck is, and also can do a flat throw thing. Gains access to Assassin. That's really the big reason. So if you feel like you want Assassin more, freer Assassin more, you can lean with X. I ended up playing 2 X decks, so I think X is the more popular one. I do think that Deus combos or Deus aggro is actually a little bit better. My reasoning is because X Echo is actually a really good assist to get yourself more cards in hand. Like it just filters better than the other deck does. X Crossfire is actually incredibly powerful and very underutilized and can snipe some decks out from the win, basically just stop them, like Tama, for example, just stop them from being able to function on their turn. The Souls is just consistent removal, which sometimes the deck really needs, and X struggles with a little bit now that there's so many good white defensive options. It plays Death Deck better, and Death Deck can win against these longer mid-ranger or control decks more. And the other thing that it does very well is just recurring from the trash to find your silver bullets every time. I know I said the other deck has a better chance at hitting like Assassin, but sometimes it's not exactly true, and this deck actually playing probably 3 of Kentoki, by the way, is what this number should be. I haven't necessarily updated this. The 3 Kentoki is enough to get you Assassin quite often. Yeah, it costs enter, but you get it more often when you need it. So I think that the deck is particularly strong. It is a very hard deck to play. These recursive red-black aggro decks are just really hard to play. Aside from the Elrig deck, which is fairly simple, like the only real hard choice is when to use X Crossfire. In order to basically, is when is it best to enter burn and when is it best to use it so that you get it for its cheapest price, is the main deck. The main deck has a lot of packages in it. The first one is this like animal Terror Beast package, which you can use to get over Machinas, and Machinas are so ambiguous in this format. Having ways to get over Machina is actually very strong, period. I wouldn't even consider it like sideboard tech, against certain decks. I think it's so much in existence that running a way to get over Machina is just bog standard good. And then Tengus get over Madoka Collapse, and Madoka Collapse are everywhere in the fucking format right now. So it is really good to get access to that. Not to mention, actually, one of the best cards that you can play against Esper decks, period, is Thoroughbred. I know it's strange to say that, but Thoroughbred does a lot of things. One, it stops Machina from being very good. It brings back a Terror Beast, specifically Tengu, which stops Madoka from being very good. Those two are very often paired to each other. Its Life Burst is fantastic. If you're against cards that are discard decks, bringing back the Tengu and saving cards in your hand at the cost of enter, but saving cards in your hand is huge. The fact that you get to draw a card at the end of turn, and this is an ability that you can miss, and I saw a lot of people missing it at the GP. The fact that you get to draw a card at the end of turn makes it really hard to battle against it as a discard deck, because most discard decks have limited amount of discard. Enough to disrupt you, but not enough to keep you discarded. And they're not like Aya, for example. And Thoroughbred actually does a fair amount of undoing that from your opponents. So yeah, I think this deck is pretty fantastic. People are harsh on Yuzuka, for example, Yuzuki, and as well as Tengu. But this together, you have enough enter burn in the deck that you can pressure the opponent. Basically, you have all these different ways to silver bullet them. You have Tama, Doomed Angels to basically get ways to just be really difficult to interact with. Same with Lalaru. Steampunk to make sure that if you need to go really, really long, which sometimes this deck can do, it can take its foot off the accelerator, use Steampunk and just once per turn damage. And yeah, it's just you got to learn how to play the deck very, very well in order to function it. But once you do, this can be a meta crusher. And that's why it's still an A tier, I guess. Let's go back to another aggro deck. So I have a Enter Denial aggro deck here that is kind of a strange one. It's almost like a blend between mono white and mono red. I'll talk more about it later in a different video, but in the meantime, you can kind of just check it out here. Basically, the idea is Yuzuki is still just your bog standard red aggro deck for the most part, and will use its abilities to strip your opponents from color. But the thing is, the Esper decks are actually really greedy when it comes to color, so this can be a very good, very, very, very good enter screw. I'm highlighting over the Signy on the field like that's the ability. Right here it is. So yeah, they can enter charge back, but you can color screw them out really, really easily with it. And then this enter charge to destroy the opponent's enter is really, really nice. So you can use that in conjunction with Go to the Top to really just completely enter deny them. It's also worth mentioning that while Entwined Supremacy is a cheap piece, this gives you the 2 enter to pay for the Entwined Supremacy if you need to stop a Life Burst. And then generally speaking, you're going to actually see this Elrig deck almost ubiquitously for any Yuzuki deck, because the Tamago just really helps sort of help that idea of just stopping the opponent from having enter, drawing some extra cards, which the deck needs, and the bounce supplements that as well. What you're going to see in the main deck is generally going to be a various amount of red and white cards that do the job of enter starving, taxing, or opening lanes. And that's more or less all of your aggro decks that you're going to see in the format. Anything else you're going to see is probably going to be somewhat of a variation of that. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and hope to see you in the next video. Lastly, we have Dash here, and this is a notable one to talk about because it's actually very, very powerful. Sometimes it can burn itself out, though, and kind of implode on itself. but it's a smaller rate than you'd think. It's like 10%. So a lot of the times it doesn't do that, and it's actually just very strong on its own. What is Dash? All right, well, Dash is basically taking the aggro deck and maximizing its damage output from every possible angle. So you take Hirana, which already has a very strong ability to not only draw a card and enter charge 1, which kind of helps you end the game a little earlier, but it's once per game action. Is you've got to down 2 Elrigs on your, they've got to be level 2 on your field, and then you get to basically do an extra damage, right? So it's very strong in that ability of it's basically a free extra attack almost. Tama Aura also gives it yet another attack. Entwined Supremacy gives it another attack, basically another way of dealing damage. Altogether, you end up with a very cheap package that the Elrig itself, when it goes Supernova, basically go 1, 2 damage, 3 damage, 4 damage, which doesn't seem like a lot, but then you remember that Endless Punchline was only 3 damage, and that was very strong back in the day too. So what is the thing that makes this tick? Well, the thing is that this deck basically has no defense, right? It has basically 2 lines of defense. The first one is Miko Miko right here, and it should be worth noting that this Miko Miko is basically just a Xenocluster. In the matchups where there's no discard relevant, it ends up being just a worse way to draw cards, but you get so many cards in hand, it really doesn't matter too much. But against the discard decks, it ends up being a Xenocluster and can basically undo a lot of what the discard does. There's actually a lot of ways this deck undoes a lot of discard does, namely Tristan as a life burst. And then the real defense trick here comes with Miko Miko Zubashan. So this is a really overcosted ability to put something on the opponent's field to the bottom of its owner's deck. That does enter deny them, and this deck does weirdly act as an enter denial deck as well by minimizing the amount of damage and then basically killing you in 1 turn after you're unable to react to them anymore. Then that's kind of how quote unquote acts as an enter denial deck. Zubashan, even though it costs 3 to bottom something, means that it basically always has an ability to shut down the opponent's card, whatever it is. Exia, Remember, Coella, H2O. There's a million cards that cause problems for aggro decks that Zubashan deals with very cleanly. It also has the added benefit of being able to strip a guard out of your opponent's hand at a pretty high cost, and that cost is cards from your hand. But generally speaking, you will have turns where you have 12 or 15 cards in the deck, so it's less of a cost than you'd think. You can recover those cards pretty easily. One notable thing that you can also do, and I also count this as the second defense thing that you can do, is Song of Wheatcross. You can Song of Wheatcross during the opponent's attack step. You get to keep the cards until the end of your attack step, and then you've got to do the discard, but hopefully by that point you've already won the game. This pairs really nicely with, if you use this right before using Zubashan, you can actually basically get fodder to discard with, or just pick the best cards in your hand to keep and discard 3 of them. To get rid of a guard. It's not always relevant. Knowing when to do the discard on Zubashan is probably the second most important part of the deck in order to play this deck efficiently. You basically need to do 2 things incredibly well. You need to decide when is the kill turn. You look at your opponent's life cloth. Basically, if they have more than 3 life cloths, so they have like 4 or more, it's probably the kill turn is probably the next turn. If they have 3 or less life cloth, then the kill turn is whatever your next turn to attack is. And when you've discovered when that turn is, that's when you turn on the abilities. So you Miko Miko, and then you Miko Miko with that defense step, then you go for the next attack stuff. You turn on Tama, you turn on Entwined Supremacy, you turn on Hirana's main ability, you go for the kill. That's the decision maker in the deck. The thing that makes the deck different than any other red deck after that is really only two specific pieces. The first part is that you're running a lot of this life burst, where you look at the top 5 cards of your deck, add up to 3 cards from among them into your hand to put the rest on your bottom. You can run the white one if you want. You're running 6 of them, right? So you can only run 4, and then you should run 2 more, I think. It could be even acceptable to run 4 more, Really, it depends on how badly you like this life burst. You can maybe cut that and go into that if you want, or cut this and go into that. It really is pretty much as simple as that. Sometimes in the late game while we're here, also you use Diabride, less because you're trying to enter screw your opponent, and more because you're still fishing for a way to get back your Flathrow or your Halberd. Um, and so this ability to discard a card, look at the top two of your deck, and put one into your hand is actually really important. Um, and the second part that makes this deck different than the normal red deck, and you can see that this is the normal red deck. It's running Ramels, it's running Zapars, it's running Eternal Influence, running Hera's, running Lancelots, all these ways to just basically open up lanes and deal damage, is Flathrow. Right, Flathrow basically reads on your kill turn, you crush one card of the opponent's life cloth. And then it can gain Assassin if you don't have cards in hand, which you don't because you discarded all your cards to this effect. This is basically the last key to make full-on hyper aggro good, because full-on hyper aggro is basically missing one good way to deal damage and one good way to avoid Signy like Exia or Remember, or some of these kinds of effects where it becomes really hard to open lanes. And Flathrow does both of those things. At a steep cost, you got to discard your hand, and it's got to be with 6 cards. Reminder, it does say may, so if you're not on your kill turn and you do have Flathrow out, you don't have to do it. It's really what binds the deck together to become a Dash Hirana as strong as it is, and really quickly win. The deck, if we're going to talk about what strengths are, the strengths are once you learn how to pilot the deck, you can play against this deck against anything and win. And I really mean that. Anything and win. The weaknesses are, there are some decks that are able to stop you if they know what they're doing, namely control decks that are able to put up walls and damage mitigation. They know tricks like Akino, bounce a card back to your hand, turn off your Flathrow, kind of thing. And bring a guard back to hand is a strong move. The other thing is about 10% of the time it just kind of falls apart on itself. And while that won't cost you really all that much in short tournament games, right? Like when you have 3 rounds or 4 rounds, it can start costing you more when you have 7 or 8 rounds, like at the GP. But that's the premier aggro deck, aside from the white aggro deck, I think, that you can be playing right now. It's Dash Hirana.